The Drillmaster of Valley Forge, the Baron de Steuben, and the Making of the American Army, by Paul Lockhart. Narrated by Norman Dietz. Copyright 2008 by Paul Lockhart. This unabridged audiobook is published by arrangement with Paul Douglas Lockhart, care of the Lippincott, Massey, McQuilkin Agency, and was produced in the year 2008 by Tantor Media, Incorporated, which holds the copyright thereto. Chapter 1. The Finest School of Warfare in the World, 1730 to 1763. If there is a war, I promise you at the end of the second campaign that your friend will either be in Hades or at the head of a regiment. Steuben to Count Henkel von Donnersmarck, June 4th, 1754. In the majestic but stark interior of Magdeburg's Reformed Church, 1 week old Friedrich Wilhelm Ludolf Gerhard Augustin von Steuben was christened on September 24th, 1730. It was a simple ceremony. Everything the Calvinists did in church was simple, stripped of pomp, but it was noteworthy for reasons other than its liturgical plainness. 2 of the men surrounding the preacher at the carved stone baptismal font that stood before the nearly bare altar wore the uniform of the Royal Prussian Army, hardly unusual since Magdeburg was a garrison town, one of the largest in this part of the Kingdom of Prussia. Yet these were distinguished soldiers with considerable social ties. The baby's given name reflected the exalted station and honorable life into which he'd been born. He was named after his godfathers, Ludolf von Lüderitz, royal forester in Magdeburg; Gerhard Cornelius von Walrabe, colonel of artillery, a Catholic of Dutch birth, who would shortly become the highest-ranking engineer officer in the entire army; and Augustin von Steuben, the infant's paternal grandfather and patriarch of the Steuben clan, a prominent theologian. These 3 men and 2 noblewomen stood close to young Friedrich's parents, who had been married only 1 year before in this same church. The 4th godfather, however, was noticeable primarily by his absence. No one expected that this final sponsor would actually show up for something so mundane as a baptism. He didn't have to. Just the fact that he'd agreed to list himself as a godfather and to allow the boy to be named after him spoke volumes about the ranking of the Steuben family. That man was Friedrich Wilhelm I, king in Prussia, the living head of the Hohenzollern dynasty. Friedrich Wilhelm, who loved his army more than he loved his own children, more than anything other than his serious and vengeful God, would not have agreed to stand in as godfather to just anyone. His doing so for this baby that day showed that the Steuben family was high in his favor, that Friedrich's father was on his way up in the world, and that baby Friedrich wouldn't have an ordinary life. Should he survive into manhood, he would grow up to be a soldier too, and great things would be expected of him. What no one present that day could have anticipated was that Friedrich von Steuben would win his fame not on the battlefields of Central Europe, but in distant America. Friedrich von Steuben was and is frequently described as German, or more specifically Prussian. He was both and neither, though he rarely was so specific in identifying his homeland. Steuben proudly acknowledged his service in the Prussian army, which began early in his life, but he always referred to his origins, his family, and his pretended land ownership as European. This lack of affinity to a particular place might appear odd to modern minds, but it made perfect sense to Steuben. It reflected the political realities of 18th-century Germany and the peculiar circumstances of Steuben's life in Europe. Germany per se didn't exist before Otto von Bismarck created it with blood and iron in 1871. and in Steuben's time the word was a mere geographical expression, referring to the German-speaking lands of the old Holy Roman Empire. Before Napoleon Bonaparte forced its dissolution at bayonet point in 1806, the empire was a strange conglomeration of some 300 quasi-independent territorial states. These states varied dramatically in size, power, and prestige, and were ruled by an equally wide variety of titled nobles, electors, princes, dukes, counts, margraves, landgraves, and so forth. At their head stood the emperor, an elected sovereign, and invariably a member of the ancient Habsburg dynasty. The emperor wielded little real power over the empire's constituent members. He was more akin to the president of a contentious federation. The individual German princes retained almost total authority over their respective subjects. They maintained their own armies, levied their own taxes, enforced their own laws, and minted their own coin. The princes obeyed the emperor when doing so suited their interests. By the time young Friedrich von Steuben reached adolescence, the princes of the empire had polarized, coalescing around two rival power centers. To the south, Catholic Austria and the emperor's court at Vienna. To the north, the upstart Protestant kingdom of Prussia. Prussia was the great political and military success story of 18th century Europe. In the previous century, as the Electorate of Brandenburg, it had been politically influential, but poor and sparsely populated, cursed with some of the worst farmland in all of Germany. The 30 Years' War of 1618 to 1648 had all but destroyed the impoverished territory, as marauding armies, economic distress, and plague laid waste to entire villages. In the second half of the 17th century, however, clever statecraft on the part of its rulers, the Hohenzollern dynasty, the very same family that would produce the German Emperor Wilhelm II, the infamous Kaiser of First World War notoriety, allowed Brandenburg not only to recover from the devastation wrought by the 30 Years' War, but even to expand its territories and build up a respectable army. In Steuben's day, the Hohenzollern ruled over a scattered but vast collection of territories, stretching eastward from the Rhine Valley to East Prussia. Now it was known as Brandenburg-Prussia, or simply Prussia. Its rulers proudly bore the title of king, a distinction unique among all of the German princes. The second king, and Steuben's godfather, Friedrich Wilhelm I, 1713 to 1740, single-handedly transformed Prussia into a major military power. Through scrimping and saving, Friedrich Wilhelm created a modern and very large army, disproportionately large given the modest size of his subject population. Plain living, coarse, and unimaginative, Friedrich Wilhelm shunned the refinements of fashionable French culture, but he made his beloved army the centerpiece of his regime. He attracted much international attention for his personal bodyguard, a regiment of giant grenadiers, each of whom exceeded 6 feet in height. Yet, for all that, he was a peaceful ruler. His son and successor, Friedrich II, better known to posterity as Frederick the Great, would not show the same restraint. Prussia's was a thoroughly militarized society in which everything was geared toward the needs of the army. It was, in Mirabeau's biting words, an army with a country, and not the other way around. Nearly 80% of the state budget was earmarked for the use of the army, which was the 4th largest in Europe, even though the kingdom ranked 10th in territorial size and 13th in population. All Prussian males, without exception, were registered for conscription at birth. Still, Prussian manpower was a precious national resource. So in order to spare the economy the loss of so much valuable labor, the Prussian kings relied heavily on foreign recruits to fill out the ranks of the army. Roughly 2/3 of Prussian soldiers in the 18th century were foreigners. It was on its officer corps that Prussia placed its heaviest demands. Officers were recruited almost exclusively from the lesser nobility, the Junker class. Military service wasn't required of the Junker, but it was certainly expected. For a poorer nobleman, a career as an army officer was most honorable, as the Prussian kings cultivated an intimate bond between themselves and their officers, no matter how lowly in rank. Unlike other European armies, all commissioned officers had direct access to the king, who in turn proudly displayed his solidarity with them by wearing the same plain blue uniforms they wore. The conditions of service were not pleasant. Promotion was slow and the pay inadequate, and officers faced the bleak prospect of a quick death in battle or an impoverished old age. But there was no greater honor than to be able to say that one had been even a mere lieutenant in the army of Old Fritz, as Frederick the Great came to be known. Military service, in short, was a way of life for the Prussian nobility, and Prussian officers held greater prestige at home and abroad than their counterparts in the Austrian, French, Russian, or British armies. It was into this latter-day Sparta that Friedrich von Steuben was born on a Sunday evening, September 17, 1730. His lineage was distinguished but unremarkable, a typical Prussian military family of the Junker class. His grandfather, the theologian and Reformed preacher Augustin von Steuben, married Charlotta Dorothea von Effern, daughter of the Count of Effern and the Countess of Waldeck. 4 of their sons pursued military careers. The youngest of these, Wilhelm August von Steuben, followed the conventional path to his Prussian officer's commission. After a brief education at the university town of Halle, 16-year-old Wilhelm August entered Prussian military service as an officer cadet, Fahnenjunker, in a cavalry regiment in 1715. His promotion through the ranks was slow but steady, typical for a man of his class. By the time of his marriage to a woman from a prominent Junker family, Maria Justina Dorothea von Jagow, in 1729, he had been promoted to lieutenant of engineers. Wilhelm August and Maria had been stationed at the bustling garrison town of Magdeburg only very briefly when their firstborn, Friedrich, came into the world. Much about Friedrich von Steuben's youth is shrouded in mystery. He would write and say very little about his childhood, which was unstable and possibly unpleasant. One aspect of his origins, however, is very clear, though historians have needlessly made it a point of controversy: his social status. Friedrich von Steuben was nobly born. In 18th century Europe, noble was hardly synonymous with wealthy. The Prussian Junker, who dominated the officer corps, were little better off than peasants. Nobility derived from bloodline, not from ownership of vast landed estates. The controversy over Steuben's claim to noble status centers on his theologian grandfather, Augustin von Steuben. Until very recently, German historians believed that Augustin was the grandson of a humble miller named Steuber. In order to seek preferment, Augustin falsely claimed descent from a defunct branch of the noble lineage von Steuben. Research in Steuben genealogy, however, has uncovered a great deal of evidence indicating that Augustin was indeed nobly born. Moreover, as a favorite preacher of the King of Prussia, he was much too visible to have effected such a blatant deception. His marriage to a woman of unimpeachable aristocratic credentials could not have taken place if Augustin had not been noble. 4 of Augustine's 8 children got married, each into prominent Junker families. All 8 of those children were sponsored at baptism by high-ranking German nobles. Young Friedrich's mother and both of his maternal grandparents came from established Junker families. His paternal grandmother stemmed from an even more refined aristocratic line. The details of his paternal grandfather's lineage may be unclear, but they were definitely noble. Measured by any yardstick, Friedrich von Steuben was indeed a nobleman. Some writers have asserted that Steuben claimed status as German aristocrat, namely a member of the higher levels of the noble estate. Steuben never said such a thing. When writing about his social origins, he never claimed to be anything other than a poor Junker or a baron, as we'll hear in Chapter 2, both of which were indeed correct. Yet Friedrich was no ordinary Junker. His baptismal tie to the king signaled that. That bond with the king was a great boon to Friedrich's father, allowing him to rise to a captaincy at a relatively young age. But that didn't mean his life would be any easier. Quite the contrary. Since Wilhelm August had talent, his services were very much in demand, but the minuscule size of the Prussian engineering arm meant that there were few opportunities for advancement beyond the rank of captain. He would be denied even the simple pleasure of raising his family in Magdeburg. In 1731, before Friedrich had celebrated his first birthday, the king sent Wilhelm August to Russia with a small group of hand-picked officers to help the Tsarina Anna rebuild her army. It was a great personal honor for Captain Steuben, who accompanied the Russian army on campaign against the Turks and earned a citation for bravery in the War of the Polish Succession, 1733 to 1738. Life for line officers in the Prussian army was hard work, dull, and unprofitable. It was doubly so for their families, and the Steuben family had it harder than most. They weren't entirely isolated, for there were plenty of Germans near them. German-born officers made up a large proportion of Tsarina Anna's officer corps, and in fact, German was the common language of command in the Russian army. But the Steubens were far, far away from their relations, some of whom they would never see again. Both of Wilhelm August's parents would pass away while their son served in Russia. Nor did the Steubens have the luxury of settling down in one place for very long. Wilhelm August's duties took him from Kronstadt to St. Petersburg to the Livonian port of Riga. The family grew during these years, but the harsh climate claimed the lives of most of the new additions. Altogether, the Steubens buried 5 of their children in Russian soil. The king recalled Wilhelm August to Prussia in 1739. It was a welcome change for the homesick officer and his dependents. It didn't mean, however, that they could get back to the relative comfort of peacetime garrison life. In 1740, Friedrich Wilhelm I died, to be succeeded by his very different son, Friedrich II. Frederick the Great was refined and erudite, as cultured as his father was boorish, but he inherited his father's love for the military life, and he had an edge that his father lacked. The new king was eager to test the mettle of the army that his father had nurtured. Only 6 months after ascending to the throne, Frederick launched his kingdom into the first of several acts of outright aggression that would earn him undying fame on the battlefield. In December 1740, his army invaded the Austrian province of Silesia, hoping to wrest the territory from the grip of the young and untried new Habsburg Empress, Maria Theresa. The First Silesian War 1740 to 1742, the opening salvo of the continent-wide War of the Austrian Succession, 1740 to 1748, first demonstrated to the world the power of Prussia's army and made King Frederick's name a household word throughout Europe. It was also a momentous event for the Steuben family. Wilhelm August was awarded the coveted order Pour le Mérite, the Blue Max, for his role in the siege of Nice in 1741, and immediately after the conclusion of peace in 1742 he was promoted to the rank of major. In an army in which 50-year-old lieutenants were commonplace, such a promotion at age 43 was a rare honor. And since the Prussian engineer corps was so small, this rank placed Wilhelm August near the very top of the chain of command. The elder Steuben had paid his dues and been suitably rewarded. Decent income was the most obvious perquisite, but there were others. The Steuben family could count on a moderately sedentary lifestyle, and if any of their sons chose to follow in his father's footsteps, the path to high rank would be all the easier. The end of the First Silesian War marks the point at which Friedrich von Steuben emerges as an individual, no longer a faceless component of the family. His father was stationed in newly conquered Silesia, first in Nice, and then in the fortress town of Breslau, Wrocław, in present-day Poland. In these two towns, Breslau especially, Friedrich would receive all of his admittedly minimal education. Breslau was a pleasant town, provincial and comfortable. It was thoroughly Catholic, though that didn't constrain the locals from fraternizing with their new, nominally Protestant Prussian overlords. Our Silesian women, one Breslauer wryly remarked, were excited with such passion for the Prussian soldiers that many of them must have been left with a little Brandenburger. Breslau was also home to a fine university, and here Friedrich von Steuben, just entering his teens, had the chance to study with Jesuit priests, renowned throughout Europe as the best educators on the continent. Time and circumstance, however, precluded even a thorough grounding in the basics, and kept his parents from giving young Steuben any better education than that which a poor young nobleman in Prussia always receives. Friedrich was nearing the age at which he would begin his military education, and as the eldest son of a military family, he didn't have many options. His first taste of military life came in August 1744, when Frederick the Great decided to renew his struggle with Maria Theresa. Prussian troops battered their way through Saxony and into Habsburg Bohemia, precipitating the Second Silesian War. Wilhelm August von Steuben was once again called to the field of battle. The elder Steuben's exalted rank entitled him to bring family members along on campaign. He took Friedrich with him. The boy was just about at the right age to begin a military apprenticeship. He celebrated his 14th birthday while observing his father at work directing the Prussian engineers as they laid siege to the ancient Bohemian capital at Prague. According to Major von Steuben's directions, blue-clad engineer troops carved carefully mapped parallel trenches with pick and spade, zigzagging rough concentric circles around the Austrian outerworks. Artillery commanders sighted their mortars and heavy siege cannon. Young Friedrich was hooked by the smoke and the noise and the excitement, by the respect that his father's office carried, and by the great responsibility that his father bore for the king. There was no doubt that he wanted all this for himself, but the engineering service wasn't enough to satisfy his already considerable ambition. One could rise only so far in the so-called technical branches, the engineers and the artillery. The real glory and the real chance for advancement lay instead in the infantry. So that was the path he chose. Friedrich von Steuben's military career began almost as soon as the war was over. In the autumn of 1746, right around the time of his 16th birthday, he donned the blue coat with rose-colored cuffs, white waistcoat, and skimpily cut white breeches of the infantry regiment von Lestwitz, Regiment No. 31, one of the units that made up the Breslau garrison. Like all aspiring officers in the Prussian army, Friedrich had to serve time in the ranks before he could qualify for his commission. He started out as an officer cadet, called Gefreitenkorporal or Freikorporal in the infantry. Officer cadets were in an uncomfortable position. They were considered NCOs while on duty, carried the company colors when on maneuvers, and had to demonstrate thorough familiarity with drill and military routine. Though not yet officers, they were nonetheless discouraged from fraternizing with other enlisted men. After 2.5 years as an officer cadet, Steuben was promoted to ensign, Fähnrich, a strange intermediate rank which offered many of the burdens but few of the privileges of a full officer. Not until he was 22 did Steuben rise to the lowest fully commissioned rank, that of lieutenant. The Prussian system of promotion and training was doubtless one of the more intimidating conditions of service for young officers. Yet it had its advantages, chief among them that it helped to cultivate the mixture of reserve and care with which Prussian officers were expected to treat the rank and file entrusted to them. Several years spent in the nebulous space between officers and enlisted men taught the officer cadets and the ensigns to appreciate the burdens of a private soldier's life. An officer was responsible for the physical welfare of each of the men under his command, and couldn't shirk his duty of training them. High-ranking officers would conduct daily drills themselves, even at the battalion level, a feature of the Prussian army that foreign observers found both strange and admirable. Even King Frederick didn't consider himself above this duty. He frequently led troops in drill, without any pomp, wearing his plain black hat and unadorned regimental coat, cuffs encrusted with the snuff he perpetually indulged in. Leadership, perhaps, cannot be taught, but the Prussian system came closer to doing just that than any other method of officer training used in a European army during that period. For the 10 years that followed his enlistment in 1746, Friedrich von Steuben remained stuck in the garrison at Breslau. As an infantry lieutenant, he was kept perpetually busy. A captain commanded each infantry company, but the lieutenants were the real workhorses. Steuben's daily activities included leading his company in hours of drill, keeping a watchful eye on the discipline and cleanliness of his men, maintaining the company's accounts and other paperwork, supervising the distribution and cooking of rations, and all of the other elements of the stultifying but necessary routine that made up life in the peacetime army. Steuben's life in the army wasn't all work. He loved the theater and attended plays when time and budget permitted, but mainly he devoted his off-duty hours to study. While most of his comrades whiled away their little free time in gambling, drinking, and frequenting brothels, he taught himself basic arithmetic and mastered French. The latter was a vital discipline for an ambitious man in his line of work. A man or woman in mid-18th century Europe couldn't claim to be truly cultured unless he or she read, wrote, and spoke French, for that was the language of learned Europeans and of those muck-raking, trouble-making social critics of the Enlightenment, the philosophes. It was also, curiously, the language of the Prussian king and his court. Any officer who aspired to great things in the Prussian army would have to be fluent in French. Steuben felt perfectly at home with the language. though his own French prose would always be inelegant and workmanlike. Lieutenant von Steuben was popular with his fellow officers and loved hearing of their comical misadventures with prostitutes and tavern keepers, but he rarely partook of the same. Next to his soldierly duties, reading was...
Sample complete. Ready to continue?